The first frost of December had turned the paving stones of Flaxborough's Market Square into treacherous grey mirrors, upon which the more self-assured citizens performed careful ballets of balance. Inside the town hall, however, warmth, good intentions prevailed. The winter charity sale, an institution in itself, occupied every inch of the council chamber. Tables sagged politely under an excess of knitted scarves, dubious sponge cakes, and last year's unsold calendars. The air was dense with the scent of tea, pastry, and the faintly ecclesiastical perfume of damp water. At precisely 11:10, Mrs. Glossop, chairwoman of the Flaxborough Women's Guild and custodian of propriety, was rearranging raffle items when Miss Hester Pendrick, a pale, bird-like woman with a permanent expression of someone expecting rebuke, gave a faint cry and staggered backward. "Oh, good heavens," said Mrs. Glossop, more annoyed than alarmed. "What is it now?" Miss Pendrick pointed. "The candles, there, 4 of them on Cyril's table." There they were indeed, 4 short, half-burnt candles arranged neatly on the cloth-covered trestle that bore the handwritten label estate of the late Mr. Cyril Pendrick, parish clerk, small items. Someone had evidently thought it sensible, or perhaps sentimental, to include the late clerk's modest belongings among the sale goods: a brass letter opener, a paperweight shaped like a trout, and a small oak box. But the candles were new arrivals. No one could recall putting them there. "They weren't here when we set up this morning," Mrs. Glossop declared, as though the very suggestion insulted her competence. "They were not," confirmed Mr. Horrobin, the town hall caretaker, who had been lingering for the free biscuits. "I locked up last night myself." By now, several others had gathered. Mrs. Blee, the rector's wife, whose theology bent easily to village melodrama, Mr. Pokeley, a retired draper with opinions about everything, and 2 younger volunteers who were already whispering in undertones about omens and a warning. The candles themselves, innocuous enough, had burned unevenly, as though extinguished in haste. Their bases left pale wax circles on the green felt cloth, and one wick was still bent and blackened. "It's symbolic," Miss Pendrick whispered. "Wee Cyril always said he'd leave a sign if there was wrongdoing." Mrs. Glossop straightened, shoulders braced in moral disapproval. "My dear, Cyril Pendrick was a parish clerk, not a necromancer. And if you're suggesting the church roof fund has wronged anyone—" But her sentence was interrupted by Constable Malley, who had been assigned to a community presence duties that morning, a euphemism for being somewhere warm. He cleared his throat with the gravity of one who enjoys a minor crisis. "This let Inspector Purbright know, ma'am," he said, not because he saw a crime, but because the alternative would have been to carry on stacking scones. Later that morning, Inspector Purbright arrived without hurry, as usual. He removed his hat, nodded to the assembled ladies and one guilty-looking caretaker, and examined the table. 4 candles, he said mildly. "Rather a good brand, I think. Church surplus." Mrs. Glossop looked offended. "They were not part of the stock, Inspector. Someone must have brought them." "Then," Purbright murmured, "we must suppose someone wanted them noticed." He inspected the ends of the candles, 2 of them still warm to the touch, and then the table label. His eyes lingered a moment on the name Pendrick. "You knew the deceased, I take it." "Everyone did," said Mrs. Blee. "Well, poor Cyril was a stickler for form, even with death duties. I dare say he's scolding St. Peter about receipts." That earned a few smiles. Miss Pendrick, however, did not join them. "He wasn't happy, Inspector," she said quietly. "Not before he died. He'd been keeping notes." "About the accounts? The parish accounts? The council's?" Purbright nodded, as if that were of mild and passing interest. He asked a few questions: where the candles had been found, who had been near the table, and when Mr. Pendrick's effects had last been touched. No one could agree on details, though all agreed it was very odd indeed. At length he thanked them, replaced his hat, and left. Constable Malley lingered, hoping for instruction. Shall I remove the candles, sir?" Purbright paused. "No, leave them there for now. Let's see who mentions them next." That evening, in his office, Purbright placed 4 short stub candles on the edge of his desk, replicas taken discreetly for examination. The flicker of the lamp made them seem to dance slightly, as though conscious of the irony. "4 candles," he murmured to himself, "and 1 cold table." He smiled faintly. If this was some rural melodrama, it would mean 4 souls condemned. In Flaxborough, it probably means someone resents the raffle committee. But even as he spoke, he noted the faint scent of wax lingering on his fingers, a scent not of church candles, but of the kind used for sealing letters. And there, for the first time that day, Inspector Purbright allowed his expression to change, slightly. Morning came to Flaxborough with a muffled quiet that only seemed to deepen suspicions. Overnight frost had rimed the market railings like lace, and those who ventured out early found that conversation, even through scarves, turned inevitably to the business of the candles. By 10 o'clock, 3 versions of the story were already in circulation, each more embroidered than the last. In one, the candles were said to have been found burning upon the table. In another, they had spelled out some cryptic arrangement pointing at the church steeple. Mrs. Blee's rendering included the faint but persistent smell of incense, something not at all Anglican. At the police station, Constable Malley was trying to appear industrious while describing, for the 3rd time, exactly how he had found the objects. Purbright listened, pipe unlit, gaze resting on the ceiling as though waiting for it to offer the missing details. They weren't there at opening, Malley insisted, but half an hour later, poof! On the table. I'd swear no one came in or out. You would swear that, said Purbright mildly. Unfortunately, the laws of physics have yet to adjust themselves to Flaxborough's sense of occasion. Malley frowned. A meaning, sir? That someone did come in, Constable. They simply did so with the good manners not to be noticed. He rose and crossed to his desk where the 4 stub candles, replicas taken for comparison, stood like small sentinels. Beside them, a few flakes of wax had been scraped from the originals and placed on paper. He had already noted their scent again that morning. Wax mixed with resin. Resin used for sealing. You ever seal a letter, Malley? I can't say I have, sir. Not since Christmas cards were invented. Purbright smiled faintly, then dismissed the man with a nod. What he did not add was that such wax, of the specific brownish variety he had detected, was commonly used by solicitors' offices in the days when propriety required one's correspondence to be both confidential and impressive. That was what had stayed with him overnight, not the theatrical arrangement of the candles, but the choice of material. Flaxborough was not short of eccentrics, but few would go to such effort for mischief. He stepped outside. The air smelled faintly of coal and distant bread. Across the street, Mrs. Glossop emerged from the bakery, wrapped in her red coat, her gait that of a woman, both busy and conspicuously seen to be so. Purbright crossed over. "Ha ha ha ha, Inspector," she said, with a wary cheerfulness reserved for civil servants who might later file reports. "Oh, I trust you're not expecting fresh developments. The ladies are quite shaken, you know. Poor Miss Pendrick has been in tears since yesterday." "I'm sorry to hear it," said Purbright. "Does she often take such things to heart?" "She is delicate," Mrs. Glossop replied, "and sentimental. The loss of her brother was distressing enough. And to have his things, his personal effects, handled by the public, well, it's indecent. Whose suggestion was it to include them in the sale?" A pause. "The council's, I believe, or perhaps the solicitor managing his estate. Pendrick's affairs were modest, hardly worth the trouble of auctioning." "Do you recall which solicitor?" "Mr. Larch, naturally. Larch and Broadley have managed every estate in Flaxborough since Noah's will was probated." Purbright inclined his head. "And Mr. Larch was present yesterday?" "Only briefly. He paid for a jar of chutney and left. Rather abruptly, I thought." That, Purbright reflected, was precisely the sort of information Mrs. Glossop excelled at providing: small, neatly packaged details, all useful once filtered of vanity. He thanked her and continued down the street. The offices of Larch and Broadley occupied a narrow building beside the post office, its brass plate polished to a moral gleam. Inside, a clerk in spectacles regarded Purbright with the solemnity of one who takes confidentiality as a sacrament. Mr. Larch himself appeared shortly after, a stooped man with the complexion of parchment and a voice that conveyed weary tolerance of both clients and daylight. "Inspector," he said, offering a hand as though unsure what one did with such a visitor. "This is about Mr. Pendrick, I presume." "Away and away," said Purbright. "A few questions about his estate, and about any correspondence he might have had recently. Routine letters only. Some invoices, a complaint to the gas board. Nothing remarkable. Did he leave any sealed documents? Testamentary or otherwise?" Mr. Larch blinked. "Sealed? Hardly. Mr. Pendrick was How shall I put it? Untidy in most matters. We have a few notes unsigned concerning parish accounts, but they're of no consequence. Purbright regarded him for a moment. And yet you attended the charity sale. Out of civic duty, said Larch quickly. I had a prior engagement and couldn't stay. Purbright smiled. Indeed, and you purchased chutney. The solicitor coloured slightly. My wife insists on local produce. Outside again, Purbright paused at the corner by the memorial. Across the square, Miss Pendrick herself was visible through the window of Blee's drapery, speaking earnestly to the rector's wife. Her expression was earnest, almost pleading. The conversation ended abruptly when she saw Purbright watching. He turned away. The wind had risen, cutting through his coat and carrying with it the faint dry scent of candle wax from the station. 4 candles, 4 debts, 4 secrets, 4 names. At his desk that afternoon, he took from the evidence envelope the label from the raffle table, the one marked estate of the late Mr. Cyril Pendrick. The ink had smudged faintly where someone's finger, not recently washed, had pressed against it. A fingerprint, perhaps, but not one he would bother sending to any laboratory. He already suspected it would belong to someone who handled far too much paper for a living. As dusk fell, Purbright leaned back, struck a match for his pipe, and stared at the row of stub candles once more. Their shadows leaned long across the blotter like small accusatory figures. He allowed himself a quiet observation, half to the smoke, half to the darkness. In Flaxborough, he said, the dead seldom speak, but the living have an unerring way of talking for them. And with that, he reached for his coat again, intending one more visit before closing. This time not to a solicitor, nor a sister, but to the undertaker who had prepared Mr. Pendrick for burial. The question of candles, he thought, might yet prove to be one of bookkeeping. The undertaker, Mr. Sallow, received Inspector Purbright with the solemn dignity of a man whose entire business depended on speaking quietly. His office smelled faintly of polish and chrysanthemums, and his ledger lay open on a desk that had once belonged, rather inappropriately, to a local bank. They'll remember Mr. Pendrick's case distinctly, Sallow said, folding his long fingers together. He passed on a Monday evening. Stroke, they said. Peaceful, though perhaps not surprised. Purbright inclined his head. You prepared him yourself. I did. A tidy gentleman, not one for extravagance. His effects were minimal: pocket watch, penknife, and a ring of keys, all duly returned to his sister. The keys? Yes, Inspector. 5 of them, one larger than the others. A desk, perhaps, or a drawer. Did Miss Pendrick say where they were from, as she seemed uncertain? Mentioned something about Cyril's drawer at the office. She was to take care of it later. Purbright thanked him, left the funereal calm of the parlour, and walked the short distance to the parish office, a squat brick building beside the churchyard that looked perpetually closed even when it wasn't. Inside, the air was dry, with dust and resignation. The caretaker, Mr. Horrobin, was polishing the brass door plate when Purbright entered. He greeted the inspector with his usual blend of respect and gossip. Still on about poor Mr. Pendrick, sir. I always said he worked himself to death. All them council figures and nobody ever saying thank you. Quite so, said Purbright. He kept his things here, I gather. A bottom drawer, left side of the desk. Locked, of course. Miss Pendrick came by after the funeral, tried a few keys, then said she'd rather not look just then. Purbright studied the desk, a plain, functional piece of oak with years of ink stains and one drawer handle slightly bent. He inserted the largest key from the ring that Sallow had described, retrieved earlier from Miss Pendrick under the polite pretext of inventory confirmation. The drawer opened with a creak like a man sighing after a long silence. Inside lay a small ledger, 2 envelopes, and several folded slips of paper. Purbright lifted the ledger first. Its pages were numbered in Pendrick's careful hand, the script neat and slightly priggish. Each page bore a name in the left column and a figure in the right, some marked era paid, others not. He turned the pages slowly. Most entries were trivial sums, £2, 5 shillings, beside the names that read like the town directory, Blee, Glossop, Horrobin, and several unfamiliar ones. Yet a pattern emerged. Every Arapaida entry corresponded to someone who had recently taken on a new parish responsibility: choir treasurer, event secretary, council assistant. The unrepaid ones, 4 in total, stood out like unlit candles: H. Pendrick, Larch, Glossop, Sallow. Purbright's brow lowered slightly. A strange mixture of relatives, professionals, and moral authorities. He replaced the ledger, opened the first envelope, and found inside a folded sheet of cheap blue paper. The writing was again Pendrick's, but sharper as though written in irritation. I can no longer pretend the accounts are whole. It will be seen soon enough. The matter of the 4 is unresolved, and I am blamed. But there will be a reckoning. He sat back, weighing the words. The matter of the 4. Poorly. 4 debts, 4 names, 4 candles. The second envelope was addressed, but not stamped, to be opened if necessary by Miss H. Pendrick. Inside were several receipts for minor payments made to the church roof fund, and one from Larch and broadly marked a consultation, confidential. The amount was modest, but the date was curious, 2 days before Pendrick's death. He locked the drawer again, pocketing only a small slip of paper that bore 4 initials, HP, GL, EG, SS, and an amount beside each. The handwriting faltered slightly at the bottom as though interrupted. Outside, the church bell was striking 3. Purbright crossed the square slowly, his coat drawn against the wind. At the bakery, Mrs. Glossop was again visible through the window, now lecturing the girl behind the counter on the proper slicing of seed cake. Her manner was brisk, her laughter a little too bright. He continued on to the solicitor's office once more. Mr. Larch looked less composed this time, his spectacles fogged slightly with nervousness. "Inspector again," he said, forcing a smile. "I assure you this has all been a misunderstanding." "We hadn't mentioned what this was," said Purbright pleasantly, "but I'm always reassured when people recognize it early." Larch swallowed. Pendrick was overworked. He made notes that might look irregular. "Nothing improper, I promise you." "Notes are seldom improper," said Purbright. "It's what they refer to that becomes inconvenient." He set the slip of initials on the desk. Larch's eyes flicked to it and back too quickly. "4 names," Purbright said. "Perhaps 4 friends, perhaps 4 favors. He thought enough of them to keep a record." Larch drew himself up. "This is an invasion of client confidentiality. But Mr. Pendrick is no longer a client," said Purbright, and the tone was mild but final. "And the law is sometimes grateful for an undertaker's discretion as much as a solicitor." He left Larch pale and silent, then made his way toward the rectory where Miss Pendrick was staying. She answered his knock with red-rimmed eyes and a fragile composure that cracked only when she saw what he carried, the ledger. "I thought I'd lost that," she whispered. "He was always writing in it, even late at night. I told him he worried too much." "Do you know what the entries mean?" She shook her head. "He called it balancing the lights." "I didn't understand. He said some things were owed in more than money." "Did he mention 4 candles?" She hesitated. "Yes, once. Said they would stand for what was left unpaid." Purbright thanked her gently, leaving her to her grief. Outside twilight was gathering, and the lamps in Market Square blinked into life one by one. As he crossed the square, he noticed Mr. Sallow again, standing by his carriage, speaking with Mrs. Glossop in tones of strained politeness. Their conversation stopped when they saw him. 2 faces turned, each wearing the same brief, startled stillness of people who realize they've been seen at the wrong moment. Purbright gave them a courteous nod and continued walking, hands deep in his pockets, the slip of initials resting against his palm like a clue that didn't yet wish to speak. Audiobooks, 4 names, 4 debts, 4 candles, and somewhere between the church and the council office, he thought, one of them had decided that light was better extinguished than seen. By the following evening, the town had settled into that delicate hush which always precedes a gossip's bloom. No new evidence had appeared, no statement had been made, and yet nearly everyone in Flaxborough could describe precisely what Inspector Purbright was onto. The details varied, but the culprit was consistently as someone you'd never expect. At 7:30, Mrs. Glossop sat in her well-upholstered sitting room, awaiting a small delegation from the Women's Guild. The gas fire hissed cheerfully beneath a porcelain shepherdess, and a decanter of sherry glowed amber on the sideboard. She had, of course, already poured herself a glass for fortification. It was her habit, she often said, to take one before company in order to ensure civility. Her husband, a retired draper and wholly domesticated soul, had long ago retreated upstairs whenever guild matters arose. Tonight, however, he lingered a moment by the door. "More meetings about that charity business, is it?" he asked mildly. "Not meetings, Samuel. Conversations. The ladies are quite unsettled." Poor Miss Pendrick is beside herself, talking of lights and debts and heaven knows what. It's time someone applied common sense. Yes, he said in that neutral tone of husbands who know when not to continue, and vanished discreetly toward his study. The knock came promptly on the half-hour. Mrs. Blee, the rector's wife, entered first, followed by Miss Wuthers, who smelt faintly of lavender and suspicion. They removed their gloves, exchanged sighs about the cold, and settled themselves with polite gratitude for the sherry that Mrs. Glossop pressed upon them. "I suppose," began Mrs. Blee delicately, "you've heard that Inspector Purbright has been asking questions again." Mrs. Glossop's brows rose, though not too far. "Indeed? About the candles, I suppose, or perhaps that silly ledger of Mr. Pendrick's." "My dear, the man seems to find significance in stationery." Miss Wuthers sipped her drink with concentration. "They say he found a list, names and figures, and that the rector's name was there." Mrs. Blee smiled with a composure acquired from years beside the pulpit. "If the church roof fund is to be dragged through the mud, I'm sure Inspector Purbright will be delighted to rinse it clean again. He does enjoy a little soap and water." A brief conspiratorial laughter followed. Then, as often happens when laughter fails to ease discomfort, silence settled with surprising weight. Mrs. Glossop poured herself another small glass. "The fact remains," she said briskly, "Cyril Pendrick was a fussy little man with too much time and too little humour. If he kept accounts, it was because he distrusted arithmetic in others. As for these tales of 4 candles, superstitious nonsense. But someone did place them," Miss Wuthers reminded. "Someone who knew what they meant." Mrs. Glossop gave a quick, dismissive wave. "A prank, a childish gesture. If I discover who, they'll find themselves struck off the guild register." She refilled the decanter and moved to the window. The street outside was empty, the lamplight soft upon the frost. She stood a moment too long before turning back. Her expression faintly changed. "Of course," she added lightly, "it is unfortunate that poor Mr. Pendrick was troubled at the end. He'd been pestering half the town about accounts. Even came to see me, would you believe, about a minor discrepancy in the flower fund." "A discrepancy," said Mrs. Blue. "A matter of 6 shillings. He was quite insistent that we'd received an overpayment. I told him that if we had, it was the Lord's doing, and left it at that." Miss Wuthers looked scandalized. "And what did he say?" "He said, rather oddly, that not all debts are owed upward." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mrs. Glossop gave a short laugh and resumed her seat. "He was unwell, obviously." When the others departed half an hour later, leaving her alone with the remains of the decanter, she stood again by the window. The reflection in the glass was slightly blurred by the lamplight, her face framed by lace curtains. Behind her the fire had burned low, and the room took on a faintly solemn air. She set down her glass carefully, as though afraid to make a sound, and crossed to a small writing desk near the piano. Unlocking it, she drew out an envelope. Inside were 2 folded notes, one in her own precise script, the other unmistakably Cyril Pendrick's. She unfolded his first. "Dear Mrs. Glossop, I must have the matter settled before the audit. I know you mean no harm, but appearances are cruel. Let us meet again Thursday evening, the usual time. 4 candles shall suffice." Her lips tightened. She slipped the note back into the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and locked it firmly. Then she poured the last of the sherry and drank it quickly, as though for warmth. A light tap came at the door. Her husband's voice drifted through. "All finished, my dear?" "Yes," she said too brightly. Quite finished." The next morning Inspector Purbright stood before the same house. The frost had turned to drizzle, and water dripped steadily from the eaves. Mrs. Glossop received him in her sitting room, all cordial efficiency. "Inspector, do come in. You've caught me between committees, but I always have time for civic duty." Purbright removed his hat, careful not to dampen her carpet. "You're most obliging, Mrs. Glossop. I wanted to ask about Mr. Pendrick. I understand he visited you shortly before his death." "Indeed, over some minor bookkeeping quibble. I told him the guild's affairs were perfectly sound. He left satisfied, I believe." "You met privately?" Her smile faltered just slightly. "Of course, there's no harm in that, surely." "None at all. You were acquainted socially, only through guild work." He was rather dull company, if I may say so. Purbright's gaze drifted toward the sideboard. 2 glasses sat there, one spotless, the other faintly marked by a ring of sherry at the base. He noted it, said nothing. When he left, Mrs. Glossop watched from the window until his figure disappeared round the corner. Then she closed the curtains, drew a long breath, and whispered to the empty room, "You've had your reckoning, Cyril. Let it end there." But even as she said it, the clock on the mantel chimed 8, and she thought, absurdly, that one of its 4 brass weights gleamed a little too brightly in the firelight. 2 mornings later, a small administrative mishap fluttered into Flaxborough's otherwise tranquil routine. It arrived, as small disturbances often did, through the hands of the post office clerk, who prided himself on a record of unblemished accuracy until that particular Tuesday. The envelope was plain, cream-coloured, and addressed in an old-fashioned hand. Mr. H. Pokeley, 3 Church Lane. Unfortunately, it was delivered instead to Mr. Horace Pokeley, 3 Church Street. A difference of 1 syllable, but considerable consequence. Horace Pokeley, retired draper and amateur philosopher of the High Street, was not a man inclined to resist curiosity. After all, he reasoned, if Providence had seen fit to place a letter into his hands, then Providence must have intended him to read it. And so by the time he realized it was not meant for him, the seal was already broken. He stared at the short message inside, written in a precise, tidy hand that bore faint resemblance to Cyril Pendrick's. "It cannot remain unacknowledged. The others have settled in kind. Yours is the only light still owed. If I receive nothing by Friday, the account will speak for itself." He read it twice, then a third time, each repetition adding a small quiver of self-righteous alarm. There was no signature. Only at the bottom, a small ink blot shaped oddly like a tear. By noon, Pokeley had made his way to the police station, convinced that some dark extortion scheme was afoot. Constable Malley, upon hearing his story, decided it warranted a higher authority and ushered him into Purbright's office with solemn importance. Purbright listened, pipe unlit, expression gently interested. When Pokeley produced the letter, he examined it closely, noting the slight indentation of a fountain pen and the faint residue of sealing wax, brown, not red. "Delivered this morning, you say?" "Yes, Inspector, to my address, though quite clearly meant for someone else. I thought it my duty to bring it. These anonymous threats lead to all manner of unpleasantness." "Indeed they do," said Purbright. "And you've no idea who the intended recipient might be?" "None, though I know most Church Lane residents. There's the dentist, the undertaker's apprentice, and of course that unfortunate Miss Pendrick." Purbright's eyes lingered a moment on the paper. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Pokeley. We shall see that it reaches the proper hands." When the man had gone, Purbright sat in silence for several minutes. The tone of the note, though unsigned, carried Pendrick's sense of order and mild indignation. But the handwriting, while similar, was subtly different, more deliberate, less cramped, as though written by someone imitating neatness rather than born to it. He compared it with the letters taken from Pendrick's drawer 2 days earlier. The phrasing echoed one in particular. "The account will speak for itself." Pendrick had used that same expression in his ledger notes. And the phrase about a lighter owed suggested more than metaphor. 4 candles, 4 debts, and 1 still unpaid. He pocketed the letter and walked to the post office, where the clerk greeted him with all the guilt of a man who senses his morning's mistake had found its way to official attention. "Understand a letter went astray," said Purbright mildly. The clerk flushed. "I'm very sorry, Inspector." "It was addressed to Mr. Pokeley, and, well, you know how many Pokeleys there are. I corrected it as soon as the gentleman brought it back." Did you happen to notice who posted it?" "Afraid not. Came in with the afternoon batch yesterday. No return address." Purbright nodded, thanked him, and stepped out into the drizzle. Across the square, the familiar figure of Mrs. Glossop was hurrying toward the Guildhall, umbrella tilted at a precise 45 degrees. Her pace betraying both purpose and avoidance. He watched her enter the side door, then turned his gaze toward the solicitor's office. Mr. Larch stood in the window, pretending to inspect some files, but watching the same door with the unease of a man who knows something unpleasant may emerge from it. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited Miss Pendrick again. She looked wan, though calmer than before. The curtains were drawn, and a single lamp lit the small parlour, giving it the muffled atmosphere of a confessional. And Miss Pendrick, he began gently, "Did your brother ever send notes, letters, to any of his acquaintances before he died?" Her hands fluttered slightly at her lap. "He wrote often, yes, eh? Little reminders, I suppose you'd call them. He liked people to be accountable. Did anyone ever take them as threats?" "Oh, some did," she said with a weak smile. "He could be so precise. He meant no harm, only order. He thought truth should be written down. Or was he expecting money? Was he expecting money? Her eyes darted away. Not money. No, just acknowledgement. There was something about those candles. He said when the four were balanced, all would be well. Balanced? Yes, when each light had been repaid. I thought he meant spiritually, but now I don't know. Purbright left her with quiet sympathy, his thoughts circling back to the misdirected note. Someone, it seemed, had taken up Pendrick's old habit of correspondence, perhaps to continue his work, or perhaps to obscure their own. That evening, as the gas lamps winked to life along Market Street, Purbright returned to the station. On his desk lay a message from Constable Malley, delivered with uncharacteristic neatness. Fire reported at council storeroom. Minor damage, cause uncertain. Purbright folded the note, slipped it into his pocket beside the threatening letter, and allowed himself a quiet exhale. A misdirected note, a misplaced key, and now a fire in a building that held nothing worth burning, except, perhaps, paper. He rose, reached for his coat, and murmured to himself with faint amusement, "And so the light shifts again." By the time Inspector Purbright reached the council storeroom, the rain had turned to a thin, misty drizzle that clung to everything like gossip. The small fire had been contained swiftly by Constable Malley and a passing milkman, whose combined efforts, one with a bucket, the other with commendable enthusiasm, had prevented anything more than scorched timber and smoke damage. The smell inside was acrid, mingling burnt paper with the damp chill of old masonry. Purbright stood among the blackened shelves, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the last curls of steam rise from a half-charred pile near the far wall. "Started here, sir," Malley said, gesturing with the authority of one who has already concluded as much. "Smouldered for an hour or more before we noticed. Might have been the wiring." Purbright crouched beside the remnants, his gaze moving over the debris with the patience of a man who allowed facts to speak only when they were ready. "Flaxborough's electricity," he murmured, "rarely works hard enough to overheat itself." He used his penknife to lift a fragment of paper from the ashes. The ink had bled and run, but a few words remained legible. "Audit, pending review." Nearby, another half-burnt sheet bore a heading that once read a roof fund, "Sub-ledger." "A wiring, you say?" he repeated, straightening. "Or perhaps someone thought to tidy the records." Malley blinked. "You mean arson, sir? An untidy word for such a neat job. Let's call it selective enthusiasm." The caretaker Horrobin shuffled forward, cap in hand, eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I locked up last night myself. Inspector—" "Oh." Not a spark to be seen. Came this morning, and there it was, smoke coming out the vent. "Any keys missing?" "No, sir. Though the main bunch was borrowed yesterday. Miss Pendrick, she said you'd authorized it." Purbright's brow lifted. "Did she? Or maybe it was that clerk from the solicitors." Can't quite recall. He dismissed the man gently, preferring not to press a witness into invention. Outside, the drizzle had strengthened, painting the cobblestones silver. The townsfolk, naturally, had gathered in a respectful crescent across the street. Their murmurs carried faintly through the rain, speculation, indignation, satisfaction. By mid-afternoon, the story had already evolved. Some said the fire had begun in the drawer containing Pendrick's accounts. Others that it had been caused by a curse written in invisible ink. One version had Miss Pendrick herself seen weeping beside the building before dawn. Purbright let the rumours run their course. They were often more revealing than evidence. He spent the rest of the morning in quiet observation, tracing who came and went from the square. By noon he had noted 3 curious visitors. Mrs. Glossop, who appeared briefly to inspect the damage with the solemnity of civic concern. Mr. Larch, who stood at a distance pretending to study his watch, and Mr. Sallow, the undertaker, who lingered longer than either, his expression unreadable. After lunch, Purbright visited the insurance office, a small corner room that smelled faintly of ledgers and floor polish. The clerk, a timid man named Petty, looked immediately offensive. "Inspector, I assure you, all paperwork was in order. The council storeroom's been insured for years. Routine renewal, just last month. By whom? A Mrs. Glossop on behalf of the Women's Guild. She handles most of their filings, you see. Efficient lady." "Indeed," said Purbright softly. "And the claim value? £1, sir." Small but generous enough for a new storeroom roof if it came to it. Purbright thanked him and left, his thoughts returning to the charred note marked Roof Fund. £200. Not a fortune, but sufficient motive for someone too genteel to steal and too prideful to admit error. By dusk he was back in his office, the windows fogged from the damp. On his desk lay the evidence, charred fragments of ledger paper, the misdirected letter, and a photograph of the raffle table taken by the local paper for its society column before the fire. In the corner of the photo, half obscured, he noticed something he hadn't before, a shape at the edge of the frame, a gloved hand placing an object upon the cloth. The hand appeared delicate but firm, the sleeve cuffed in lace. He smiled faintly. "Hardly the glove of a vandal," he murmured. The telephone rang, Constable Malley again, excitement thick in his voice. "Sir, you might want to come by the Guildhall. Mrs. Glossop says someone's broken into her meeting room. Window forced, papers disturbed." Purbright exhaled slowly. "And what exactly is missing? She's not sure. Says it was all very odd. Nothing taken, just moved about." "I see," said Purbright. "Tell her not to touch anything. I'll be there shortly." When he arrived, the Guildhall's meeting room was still lit, the air faintly scented with lavender and polish. The window had indeed been forced, though clumsily. Several drawers stood open, their contents strewn about, paper doilies, minutes of meetings, and a box of raffled tickets. Mrs. Glossop, pale but composed, stood near the fireplace. "Inspector, I'm quite shaken. Who would wish to trouble our guild records?" "Records can be troublesome things," said Purbright. He lifted a scattered sheet from the floor, an itemized list titled Disbursement Church Roof Fund. Several entries were crossed out in heavy pencil, but one remained uncancelled. "Payment pending. See Pendrick verification required." He looked up. "You recall who wrote this?" She hesitated. Cyril insisted on reviewing everything. It was his own handwriting, I think. "We kept the papers after his death." He folded the paper neatly. "I imagine you did, and perhaps someone wished to see them again. Do you believe the fire and this intrusion connect?" "We believe," said Purbright, his tone mild but deliberate, "that Flaxborough has lately developed a most inconvenient memory. As he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. Inspector, surely you don't suspect me of anything improper?" He looked at her for a long, courteous moment. "Improper? Oh, no, Mrs. Glossop. Merely of remembering something you would prefer forgotten." Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was sharp, the sky washed pale. Across the square, the dark windows of the solicitor's office reflected the faint gleam of gas lamps. Purbright lit his pipe and walked slowly toward the station, each step deliberate, thoughtful. Behind him, unseen in the Guildhall window, the reflection of the streetlight shimmered briefly, like the wavering glow of 4 unseen candles. By Wednesday morning, Flaxborough was in full and generous possession of the facts, most of them incorrect, but all delivered with confidence. Every shop bell and doorstep became a pulpit of speculation. The townsfolk, united by civic spirit and a shared enthusiasm for gentle interference, devoted themselves to aiding the investigation in the only way they knew, by discussing it incessantly. The draper's assistant swore she'd seen Miss Pendrick in tears outside the Guildhall at midnight, though she later revised the hour to some time before tea. Mrs. Blee reported that the rector had found a melted candle stub on the church porch, a detail which, on examination, proved to be a lump of soap discarded by the Virgin. And Mr. Pokeley, having rediscovered his sense of public duty, called daily at the police station with fresher leads, each less useful than the last. Inspector Purbright received these contributions with the same patient courtesy he might have afforded a parish bake sale. He wrote very little in his notebook, mostly small shapes and dates that seemed to comfort the talkative. In return, they left his office feeling rather pleased with their usefulness, which was all the encouragement required to keep them recurring. That morning's most insistent visitor was Mr. Sallow, the undertaker. He entered with an air of restrained indignation, hat clutched to his chest. "Inspector, I understand there are unpleasant rumours suggesting impropriety in the handling of late Mr. Pendrick's effects. I assure you, everything was managed according to regulation. My profession depends on discretion." "Indeed," said Purbright. "You delivered his keys to Miss Pendrick?" "Precisely so, though she seemed reluctant to take them. Said they belonged to a drawer she did not wish to open." "And you informed no one else of that?" "Certainly not. Confidentiality is the marrow of my trade." Purbright nodded. "An admirable principle, one that seems to be dying out." Sallow blinked, unsure whether to take it as praise or criticism, and departed soon after, leaving behind the faint odour of embalming fluid and wounded dignity. By mid-afternoon, the town's helpfulness reached its peak when Mrs. Glossop organised an impromptu discussion tea for the guild members, under the pretext of moral support for Miss Pendrick. In practice, it was a tribunal conducted with sponge cake. Miss Pendrick sat stiffly at the table's end, hands clasped as the others fluttered around her like solicitous pigeons. Mrs. Blee, as self-appointed spiritual mediator, had brought a small hymn book for comfort. "My dear," she began, "and none of us believe a word against your late brother. Whatever these fires and notes signify, they cannot touch his good name." "I'm not sure they can't," Miss Pendrick murmured. "He was troubled about something, and he said some people would prefer his light put out." "Oh." Mrs. Glossop, refilling her teacup, gave a quick, sharp smile. "A metaphor, my dear. Your brother had a flair for the dramatic. In any case, we are all quite innocent in this business." Miss Pendrick looked down, her voice faint. "Are we?" The silence that followed was interrupted by a gentle knock at the open doorway. Inspector Purbright stood there, hat in hand, expression politely apologetic. "Do forgive me," he said. "I was told there might be tea." Mrs. Glossop recovered quickly. "Oh, Inspector, how unexpected. We were only comforting poor Hester. Such dreadful times for her." "Quite," said Purbright, "though I sometimes think Flaxborough finds dreadful times rather invigorating." He accepted a cup, declined sugar, and seated himself near the fire. "Oh, sir." His eyes moved idly from face to face, pausing just long enough to unsettle each in turn. "I understand," he continued conversationally, "that the Guildhall suffered an unfortunate disturbance. Papers displaced, drawers open. Nothing stolen, of course." Mrs. Glossop's tone was brisk. "A senseless act of vandalism. I've already informed the council. A good of you, and no items missing. Are none worth mentioning. Old committee minutes, raffle list, things of no consequence." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Curious, though, that the fire at the storeroom occurred the same night those papers were disturbed. Coincidence can be such a fragile thing." Mrs. Blee gave a nervous laugh. "Surely you don't imagine some connection?" "I imagine very little," said Purbright mildly. "But sometimes one must tidy up after coincidence just to see what's underneath." He placed his cup down with care, rose and gave a courteous bow. "A thank you, ladies. Your assistance, as always, is invaluable." When he had gone, conversation resumed in a lower key. Mrs. Glossop's composure had hardened slightly, as if polished against unease. "That man," she said, "finds mischief where there is none. He ought to concern himself with burglars, not respectable women." Miss Pendrick said nothing. Teacup trembled faintly as she set it down, spilling a few drops on the cloth. One landed directly upon the hem of Mrs. Glossop's sleeve, leaving a small, irregular stain that spread like a shadow. That evening Purbright sat alone in his office, pipe smoke curling lazily above the lamp. On the desk lay a sheet of paper containing 4 names: Pendrick, Larch, Glossop, Sallow, and beneath them a 5th, faintly pencilled, H. Pendrick. He stared at it for a long moment, then reached into the evidence folder for the misdirected letter. The handwriting, he now realized, was not Pendrick's nor his sister's. It had a curiously deliberate femininity, the kind produced by someone accustomed to writing thank-you notes, not threats. The bell on his desk rang softly. Constable Malley entered, hesitant. "Sir, about that fire. Insurance man says the claim's already been filed. Yesterday afternoon. Name of Mrs. E. Glossop." Purbright nodded once. Efficient as ever. When Malley had gone, he leaned back, watching the lamp flame waver. The town, he thought, had indeed been helpful, perhaps more so than it intended. They had told him everything, though none of them yet knew what they'd said. Outside, the rain began again, fine and persistent. In the square below, someone closed a shop shutter with a hollow clang that echoed faintly against the damp walls. Purbright listened a moment longer, then turned down the lamp and murmured to himself, "In Flaxborough, truth is never hidden. It's simply too well-mannered to raise its voice." Next morning dawned pale and colourless, as though the town itself had taken to modesty. Inspector Purbright left the station early, walking through the market square while the stalls were being set up. The fishmonger's cart gleamed damply. The butcher's boy whistled tunelessly, and from somewhere behind the post office came the faint clatter of milk churns. Ordinary sounds, steady and innocent, which only made the oddities of the past week seem more deliberate. He paused outside the undertaker's premises where a discreet sign announced, "Sallow and Sons, funeral arrangements, dignity assured." The blinds were half drawn, and the faint scent of polish and lilies drifted through the open door. Purbright stepped inside. Mr. Sallow appeared almost immediately, moving with the noiseless precision of a man whose livelihood depended on never startling anyone. His thin, pale hands folded over one another as he inclined his head. "Inspector, a rare honour. I trust there has been no bereavement?" "Not recently," said Purbright, "though some records have perished in less natural fashion." Sallow smiled faintly, unsure whether the remark was humorous. "Ah, the council fire. Tragic waste, no doubt. A municipal property seldom enjoys a graceful end." "And have come about Mr. Pendrick," Purbright said. "There are a few details of his arrangements I'd like to clarify. But by all means, I keep meticulous notes." He led the inspector through to the back office, a tidy room smelling faintly of varnish and candle grease. Along one wall, neat shelves held black folders marked with names in copperplate. Sallow selected one without hesitation and opened it on his desk. "The late Mr. Cyril Pendrick," he read, "age 62. Cause of death, cerebral thrombosis. Certificate issued by Dr. Wharton. Interment at St. Luke's, third plot on the eastern side. Simple coffin, oak veneer, burial attended by sister and 2 members of the council." "Efficient," murmured Purbright. "And the paperwork? In order, I trust, entirely, though there was one small amendment. Nothing irregular, I assure you." Purbright looked up. "An amendment?" "Yes, the date of burial was altered at the request of the solicitor, Mr. Larch. Originally set for Thursday, postponed to Friday. Apparently some matter of verification. He said the accounts needed final confirmation." "I thought it unusual, but not improper." "And the burial register?" Sallow hesitated, then turned in his chair to open a drawer. "Here, you'll see the alteration is quite transparent. I dislike erasures." Purbright examined the page. The date, written first in black ink, had been crossed out and replaced neatly in blue. The new entry matched the day following Larch's last recorded meeting with Pendrick. "I take it you retain the receipt?" "Of course." Sallow produced a small slip identical in handwriting to the ledger found in Pendrick's drawer. The same tidy loops, the same faint indentation where the nib had hesitated. "Did Mr. Larch bring it personally?" "He did. Paid in cash." Unusual for his profession, but not unheard of. He was quite particular about receiving a printed receipt. Purbright studied the paper a moment longer, then folded it carefully into his pocket. "Tell me, Mr. Sallow, did anyone else visit here about the time of the funeral?" "Only Miss Pendrick. She brought flowers, as one might expect," and Mrs. Glossop called, "ostensibly to inquire after suitable hymns for civic use. I presumed it was her manner of paying respects." "And did she see the register?" Sallow frowned slightly. "Now that you mention it, she did glance at it while I was fetching her tea. I thought nothing of it. The entry was still in black ink then." Purbright nodded, the faintest ghost of a smile appearing at one corner of his mouth. "You're most helpful, Mr. Sallow, far more so than you realize." Sallow's expression flickered between pride and apprehension. "If I may ask, Inspector, what precisely is all this about?" "I do dislike having my establishment mixed up in scandal." "Scandal," Purbright said gently, "is seldom created by its participants. It's usually assembled afterward by the innocent. When he left, the morning had brightened a little. The sun, reluctant but dutiful, showed its face above the rooftops. Across the street, the solicitor's office blinds were drawn tight, though Purbright thought he saw a shape move behind them. He decided to postpone a visit. Larch, when cornered, tended to talk too much too soon, and he preferred to let his anxieties mature. Instead, he walked toward the churchyard. The ground there was soft with recent rain, and his shoes left careful prints as he crossed to the eastern plots. Pendrick's grave was modest, no inscription beyond name and dates, the soil still slightly sunken. A small bunch of wilted chrysanthemums lay at the base. He stood a moment, hands clasped behind him, as if paying a visit to thought itself. Then he noticed, beside the headstone, a stub of candle half buried in the mud. It was unlit, its wick blackened, as though once used and extinguished hurriedly. He bent, lifted it delicately, and turned it between his fingers. The scent was unmistakable, the same restless tang of sealing wax he'd traced since the beginning. As he straightened, the sound of footsteps on gravel reached him. Miss Pendrick approached, wrapped in her grey shawl, face drawn but composed. "I hoped I'd find you here," she said softly. "The rector told me you'd been asking questions about my brother again." "I often do that with the departed," Purbright replied. "They tend to be less evasive than the living." She gave a faint, humourless smile. "Did you find what you wanted?" "Not yet, but I may have found who wanted it hidden." She looked down at the candle in his hand. "He said they would mark the truth, each one for a debt repaid, but someone else lit them after he was gone." "Someone," said Purbright quietly, who feared the last light would still be burning. They stood in silence a moment longer, the faint wind stirring the wet grass. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "You'll find them, won't you? The ones who hurt him." "Oh, we expect," Purbright said, replacing the candle in his pocket. "They'll find themselves first." As he walked back toward the square, the church bell struck 11. Its echo rolled through the narrow streets like a slow reminder. Behind him the graves lay still, but he could not help imagining the faint flicker of unseen flames, 4 lights dwindling, one by one, until only smoke remained. That evening found Inspector Purbright alone in his office, a small lamp burning low beside the window. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping lightly against the panes like a restless typist. The station was quiet. Even Constable Malley had abandoned his paper to doze near the stove. Purbright sat behind his desk, hands folded beneath his chin, and studied the single candle stub he had brought from the churchyard. It stood on the blotter, pale and unremarkable, yet it seemed to hold the stillness of the whole investigation. The flame was gone, but its faint scent of resin and smoke clung to the air, a modest ghost unwilling to leave. He thought, not for the first time, that Flaxborough's morality had the texture of wax, soft when warmed by reputation, yet quick to harden into something inflexible once exposed to scrutiny. Everyone, it seemed, burned just brightly enough to be seen, but never long enough to be known. His notes lay open beside him. Pendrick's ledger, the misdirected letter, the altered burial date, the small matter of the insurance claim, each piece tidy in itself, and yet together forming something that refused to resolve cleanly. The crimes of Flaxborough were rarely grand. They were always moral before they were legal. The line between righteousness and convenience blurred easily when no one was watching. He drew on his pipe, letting the smoke drift upward in slow curls. "4 candles," he murmured aloud, each marking a debt, a promise or a sin politely forgotten. The rhythm of the phrase appealed to him. There was symmetry in it, an accountant's poetry. In his mind he traced again the circle of those 4 names, Pendrick, Larch, Glossop, Sallow, and the faint, penciled 5th. Pendrick had died before his reckoning could be completed. Someone had finished it for him, not by murder, perhaps, but by erasure. The fire, the missing records, the altered register, these were acts of concealment, not passion, neat crimes for neat people. He could still hear Miss Pendrick's voice from the graveyard. He said the candles would mark the truth. And then her tremulous confession. Someone else lit them after he was gone. It was a simple observation, but it contained everything. Someone had revived the symbols Pendrick meant as reminders, perhaps to disguise their meaning, perhaps to mock it. Purbright leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Faces drifted through his thoughts. Mrs. Glossop's tidy smile, perfectly arranged. Mr. Larch's nervous habit of polishing his spectacles when cornered. Sallow's precise, almost reverent care for the dead. Miss Pendrick's fragile grief, which might yet hide resentment. And all of them circling one small man who had taken moral bookkeeping too literally. He thought again of the note. The account will speak for itself. But accounts in Flaxborough seldom spoke. They were edited, tidied, and sometimes quietly burned. He had seen it too many times, how decency, that most prized local currency, was spent lavishly to purchase silence. He turned back to the candle and struck a match. The flame caught reluctantly, flickered, then steadied into a small, clean glow. For a while he watched it without moving, letting its reflection tremble in his eyes. There was a certain honesty in fire. It consumed what was given without preference or prejudice. It revealed in its way the things people most wanted hidden, the fragility of paper, the faint trace of ink, the fingerprints left behind. The storeroom fire had not destroyed everything. It had simply illuminated what needed to be noticed. He rose, crossed to the window, and watched the rain blurring the lamps outside. The market square lay empty now, but he could imagine the houses around it. the parsonage where Miss Pendrick prayed and worried in equal measure, the glossy windows of Mrs. Glossop's drawing room, where neatness was a form of faith, the shuttered office of Mr. Larch, where guilt wore the pleasant disguise of paperwork. They were all, he thought, trapped by their own respectability. No thieves, no villains, just citizens adjusting the light to flatter their reflection. Flaxborough's crimes were always domestic, homely, the kind that began with kindness and ended with embarrassment. The candle on his desk had burned down a little, its wax pooling gently onto the blotter. He extinguished it with a slow breath. In the silence that followed, the faint sound of Mally snoring near the stove seemed oddly comforting, a reminder that innocence, however sleepy, still existed somewhere in the building. Purbright returned to his chair and opened his notebook. His handwriting was spare, economical, the ink a soft brown that matched the furniture. He wrote a single sentence. The one who feared the light most was the one who lit it last. He underlined it once, then closed the book. It wasn't proof yet, just an idea, a line of thought with its own quiet logic. But the circle was closing. He could feel it. A gust of wind rattled the window, and for an instant the lamplight wavered, throwing a brief shadow across the wall. The shape of it, uneven and uncertain, reminded him of the photograph. The gloved hand, the lace cuff. He would have to speak to Mrs. Glossop again, though not as before. The time for politeness was nearly over. He leaned back, folding his hands. "A candle's in character," he murmured. "Both melt under heat. It's only a matter of how long one keeps the flame." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the town resumed its quiet, watchful stillness. Somewhere down the street, a clock struck midnight. In Flaxborough, another day had ended, neatly as always, though the air still smelled faintly of smoke. 2 days later, Inspector Purbright accepted an invitation he had not been formally offered. Mrs. Glossop was hosting one of her Thursday teas, those immaculately managed affairs where the women of Flaxborough gathered to reassure each other that order, decency and sponge cake would always prevail. The inspector's arrival caused the mild but delicious disturbance that only authority in the wrong room can bring. He appeared at the doorway just as Mrs. Glossop was explaining, for the benefit of a newcomer, that a moral decline begins with untidiness. His silhouette framed by the light from the hall, hat in hand, he looked almost apologetic. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he said pleasantly. "But since I've been told that half the town's wisdom gathers here weekly, it seemed efficient to consult it directly." There was a flurry of teacup adjustments, murmured welcomes, and one suppressed sigh from Mrs. Glossop herself. She gestured toward a chair. "Inspector, how very unexpected. How very unexpected. Do sit down. Would you care for tea or something stronger?" "Tea, thank you," said Purbright. "I find clarity improves when the mind stays sober, though the tongue often objects." Laughter fluttered briefly around the table. He accepted the cup and waited, perfectly patient, as conversation attempted to reassert its previous, safer rhythm. Mrs. Blee resumed speaking of hymn selections for Sunday. Miss Wathers mentioned the council's discussion about repainting the bus shelter. Through it all, Purbright sipped quietly, gaze moving between them with the mild curiosity of a man studying a still life. After a pause, he spoke with deceptive casualness. "I've been thinking a great deal about our late Mr. Pendrick, a conscientious man by all accounts. One wonders what it was that finally disquieted him." Mrs. Glossop's smile tightened slightly. "I imagine his health, Inspector. He was never robust." "Or possibly," said Purbright, "although he seems to have been active enough to write letters to several of you in his last weeks." The air changed. The smallest sound, china meeting saucer, suddenly seemed loud. Miss Wathers looked up sharply. Mrs. Blee blinked twice. "Letters?" asked Mrs. Glossop with the crisp incredulity of one who finds herself accused of sentiment. "I certainly received no letter from the man." "Really? How curious." "How curious?" "Others did. Some with figures, some with apologies. I even have one here." He reached into his pocket and drew out the now familiar folded sheet, its creases worn soft from handling. Addressed in a very steady hand. It was oddly enough misdelivered. These things happen. He laid the note on the table. The women leaned forward collectively, unable to resist. Only Mrs. Glossop remained still, her expression carefully neutral. "Threatening, don't you think?" Purbright continued lightly. "But perhaps not to everyone. To some, it might read as a final reminder." "Our reminders are not threats," she said quickly. "No, but debts can be." There was a pause. The clock on the mantel ticked once, twice. The tea had cooled in its cups. Mrs. Blee spoke first, voice faintly tremulous. "Inspector, surely you don't mean to suggest that any of us—" "Ah, ooh, nothing of that sort," said Purbright kindly. "But you see, fires do make me curious. One in the council storeroom, one in a hearth perhaps not far from here, both removing inconvenient papers. Both occurring within days of each other. One might call that coincidence, though I found coincidence rather shy of repetition." Mrs. Glossop's chin lifted. "I'll not have my good name linked with scandal, Inspector. The Guild's records were harmless. If they burned, it was by misfortune. Then I must apologize for even thinking otherwise," said Purbright. He rose slightly as though preparing to leave, then paused and added almost as an afterthought, "Still, I can't help noticing that the receipts from the roof fund were missing before the fire, and that the insurance claim for the storeroom was filed before the smoke cleared. Remarkable efficiency." A small clatter broke the silence. Her teaspoon had slipped from her hand and struck the saucer. The other women looked from her to Purbright and back again, their eyes bright with something between alarm and fascination. "He handled the paperwork," she said finally, "as I've always done. Mr. Pendrick knew of it. He approved every line." Purbright nodded. "Then I imagine he would be pleased to see his accounts balanced at last." The words hung in the air, deceptively gentle. Mrs. Glossop's face seemed to pale a shade. She lifted her chin once more, and now the movement looked more like defence than pride. "You have no proof of impropriety," she said. "I seldom do," replied Purbright softly, "until someone insists upon telling me so." He set down his teacup with care and offered a small, formal bow. "I thank you for your hospitality, ladies, and for the tea. It was instructive." He turned toward the door. "Which of us?" Behind him he heard the low hum of conversation rising again, strained and uneven. Mrs. Blee's whisper was the first to pierce it. "My dear, why ever did you go pale?" Mrs. Glossop did not answer. Her hand, still resting near the fallen spoon, trembled faintly against the white cloth. Outside, the afternoon light was waning, and the town lay washed in that peculiar grey that seemed neither daylight nor dusk. Purbright stepped out into the chill air, closing the gate behind him with its familiar iron click. He walked slowly toward the square, his expression unreadable, the faintest curve of satisfaction beneath the calm. He had not accused, not yet. He had merely asked a question, and the question had answered itself. At the corner, he paused and looked back once toward the house, where a single window glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. Then he lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the wind, before he murmured under his breath, "The last light flickers soon enough." He walked on, the flame fading to ember in his cupped hand, while behind him, in the quiet parlour of Mrs. Glossop's house, the first whisper of panic began its slow, inevitable burn. The following afternoon was clear and windless, as though the weather itself had paused to listen. Flaxborough moved at its usual, respectable pace, grocers stacking apples, the rector nodding politely to widows, the postman taking a longer route than necessary in case any doorway yielded gossip. The town, outwardly, was calm again. But beneath that mild surface, the small tremor of scandal ran quietly, passed from lip to lip like a communion too sacred to name. In his office, Inspector Purbright stood by the window, watching the square with the patient detachment of a man waiting for something inevitable. On his desk lay three objects: a half-burned candle, a page from Pendrick's ledger, and the letter misdelivered to Mr. Potley. Each piece, unremarkable on its own, seemed to radiate meaning when placed together. The truth, he knew, did not need to shout. It simply waited until everyone else grew quiet. The door opened softly behind him. Constable Malley entered, removing his cap with the careful reverence of one approaching revelation. "Sir, Mrs. Glossop's asked to see you. Says it's urgent." Purbright turned. Did she sound distraught? Hard to say, sir. She was very polite. "Ah," said Purbright. "That's always a worrying sign," gestured to the papers. "Bring these along, would you? I believe we're due for a little accounting." They found Mrs. Glossop seated stiffly in her own drawing-room, the same one where she had presided so confidently only the day before. Now the curtains were half-drawn, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and anxiety. On the sideboard stood the decanter of sherry untouched. Her husband hovered near the hearth, silent and grey-faced. "Inspector," she began, rising slightly, "I would prefer to speak privately." "Of course," said Purbright, motioning Malley to remain near the door. "We shall pretend he's a piece of furniture." She managed a brittle smile, then folded her hands tightly. I've had time to think about what you said yesterday. About those letters, I realize now that appearances have become unfortunate. But I assure you, I did nothing wrong." Purbright inclined his head. "Wrong is such an ambitious word, Mrs. Glossop. I find imprudent less judgmental." She hesitated as if the mildness of his tone unsettled her more than accusation would have. Cyril Pendrick was persistent. He worried over accounts that weren't his concern. I tried to explain, but he would not listen. He came here one evening quite late, demanding explanations. There was nothing to hide, nothing truly, but his manner. Oh, he was so sure of himself. "And you offered him sherry," said Purbright quietly. Her eyes widened. "How did you—" "It's a simple deduction," he said. "You always offer sherry when you mean to keep control of the conversation. You did the same for me." She sank slightly into the chair, colour draining from her cheeks. "He accused me of falsifying guild accounts, said there were overpayments, 4 of them, diverted from the roof fund to private use. I told him he was mistaken. He said he would go to the council. He even wrote it down." But he didn't go," said Purbright. "And nor did he send his letters. Instead, he died quietly, and the matter ended there, if not for those candles." Her gaze flickered toward the table where the decanters stood. "He lit them here," she whispered. 4 of them. Said they stood for each name in his book. I told him it was blasphemous, using symbols like that. But he said it was to remind him who had received what. He said when all were extinguished, the debt would be balanced. I blew them out myself after he left. It was foolish, I know, but they unnerved me. And yet, Purbright said softly, someone lit them again. She looked up sharply. "Not I swear it." "I believe you," he said almost kindly. "But someone wished them seen. Perhaps as a warning, perhaps as justice." Her composure wavered. "You think I think," said Purbright, "you were not alone in your difficulties with Mr. Pendrick's conscience. Mr. Larch delayed the funeral by a day to verify accounts. Mr. Sullow altered the register to match that change for a small fee. You, of course, prepared the insurance claim before the storeroom fire. Each of you tidied something. None of you killed him. No, Flaxborough doesn't stoop to that. But all of you helped bury what embarrassed you." She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "He was cruel," she whispered. "He said he'd expose us all. Over trifles. He couldn't understand how this town works. People trust me, Inspector. They depend on me to keep things smooth. If every mistake were paraded in public, we'd all drown in shame." Purbright regarded her a long moment, his voice low but steady. "So you smoothed it over. Burned a ledger, misfiled a receipt, filed an insurance claim to cover what didn't balance. A candle for each act until none remained to give off light." Her eyes filled, but not with remorse. "You don't understand, Inspector. We meant no harm. We only wanted peace." "I do understand," said Purbright, with that faint melancholy that softened his tone. "You wanted quiet, and now you shall have it. There's no law against embarrassment, Mrs. Glossop, though it has destroyed more souls than murder." She looked at him helplessly, the last of her poise collapsing into a small, exhausted sigh. "What will you do?" "Very little," he said. "The council will tidy the records again, as councils do. The papers I've collected will remain where they are. But the story of 4 candles will travel, and in Flaxborough that's punishment enough. People will remember, not what you did, but that you were spoken of. That will last longer than prison." Her husband, who had remained silent until then, spoke quietly. "You're merciful, Inspector." "No," Purbright replied, "a merely realistic. Punishment, like fire, needs oxygen. Best to let it smother itself." He rose, nodded courteously, and turned to leave. At the door he paused, glancing once more at the sideboard. "If you're wise, Mrs. Glossop, you'll put that decanter away. It's caused enough trouble." Outside, the afternoon sunlight had begun to fade into the mellow gold of early evening. Purbright walked slowly back toward the square, pipe unlit, his thoughts drifting as the cobblestones echoed beneath his steps. The town seemed already to have resumed its usual rhythm. The baker's boy called out greetings. A dog barked idly from a doorway. Respectability had drawn its curtains once more. At the corner he saw Miss Pendrick standing by the post office, clutching a small parcel. When she saw him, she approached hesitantly. "Inspector," she said, "is it true that the matter is finished?" "As much as it ever will be," he said gently. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then I'll have my brother's things back, his papers. I'll see to it," he said. You may keep the ledger if you wish. I suspect it'll comfort you more than anyone else." She looked down. He was too good for this town, too honest. He never learned that truth isn't welcome unless it's flattering. Purbright smiled faintly. See, honesty and candles share the same flaw. They both draw attention while they burn. She managed a small, sad laugh. "Will you come to his grave again?" "Perhaps," he said, "when the wax has cooled." He watched her walk away, her figure slight against the lengthening shadows. When she was gone, he took from his pocket the last of the candle stubs. It had hardened now, its scent almost faded. He placed it on the edge of the fountain in the square, where the water caught the late sun and shimmered faintly around it. "Half 4 candles," he murmured, "for 4 souls who feared the dark and made it instead." He turned toward the station, the quiet of the town closing softly behind him. In the upper windows of the council offices, the lamps were being lit again one by one, as if the town, without knowing why, felt safer for a little light. Back in his office, he wrote a brief summary for the file. His handwriting, as always, was spare, precise. He concluded with one line: "A no further action. Matter concluded by natural means." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added beneath it, "A moral cause, civic embarrassment." He closed the folder, placed it neatly on the pile of finished cases, and reached for his pipe. The first match flared and died, the second caught, glowing briefly before settling to a steady burn. For a long moment he sat without moving, the faint rise and fall of smoke the only sign of life in the still room. Outside, the last light of day lingered across the rooftops of Flaxborough, fading with the same quiet dignity as its inspector's thoughts. The ledger was balanced, the candles were spent, and in the comfortable hush of small-town evening, order had been restored, not perfect but acceptable, which in Flaxborough was as close to justice as anyone ever hoped for.